Hello and welcome to Game Design Classics. My name is Michael, and in this series we're going to be taking a look back to the past, having a look at some highly influential video games and analysing them from a game design perspective. We will be having a look back at the history of these games, what they achieved on release, how they influenced later titles, and most importantly, what they're like to play today. Are they still a fun game, or are they a relic of a bygone era of video gaming? Today we're going to be popping back to 1996 to have a look at id Software's classic, Quake. Quake originally started development in 1991, just following the release of the original Commander Keen trilogy. Its upcoming status was even teased in Commander Keen 3. Ultimately, some prototyping was done in the early 90s, but it was decided that the level of technology they needed to make Quake a reality just didn't quite exist yet. Quake was shelved, and id Software began work on Wolfenstein 3D and ultimately Doom and Doom 2. Following on from the amazing success of Wolf 3D and Doom, id Software began work on their next groundbreaking title, Quake. As it turns out, the Quake that was planned back then is very different to what arrived on store shelves in 1996. Quake was originally planned as a melee-focused third-person action RPG that had support for a VR headset and voice communication over a local area network. The player would take control of the main character, Quake, a big tough Thor-like fella with a magic hammer, lightning bolts he shoots out everywhere. He came straight from id Software's Dungeons & Dragons campaign. The development process, however, was a troubled one. As John Carmack was busy working on the new fully 3D engine that would be needed to power Quake, levels and concepts were created, and then thrown out. Code was written, and then needed to be rewritten as the engine changed and adapted to what was needed. Basically, to sum it up, while the engine was being worked on, no game design got done at all, and it was really starting to wear down everyone at id. A year or so into development, the game's engine was finally complete, but there was no actual game to show. id Software held a meeting to discuss the state of the game and what could be done. One of their new hires was American McGee. Yes, that American McGee, that guy. He suggested that Quake could have weaponry more in the style of Doom, and the majority of id Software was very much in support of the new direction. Eventually, the fantasy art style gave way to an otherworldly horror that was directly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Boot up Quake for the first time and it wastes no time introducing itself. You're presented with your difficulty selections not as options in a menu, but paths from which you have to traverse to enter the main chamber. You think you're good enough to play on hard? Well, you'll have to get across the lava first. You want to play on the really tough nightmare difficulty? Well, you'll have to find it. Only id Software could create a game where you can die selecting your difficulty. That's how metal they are. From here, Quake branches off into 4 separate episodes. This is pretty typical for shareware games at the time. Completing each episode rewards you with a rune, and when you've got all 4 runes, it's off to the final area of the game to tackle the big baddie. The first thing you'll notice in heading through Quake's early levels is the emphasis the game places on verticality in its level design. This was one of the first fully 3D games, and when I say fully 3D, I mean it. Previous titles such as Wolf 3D, Doom, Duke Nukem 3D relied on heavy use of sprites, and the level geometry really was just 2D with some trickery involved to make it look 3D. Quake went balls to the wall with its commitment to full 3D. Even the muzzle flashes are 3D models. That's insane. id Software took great advantage of the added dimension, moving away from the sprawling, horizontal key-collecting mazes of Wolf and Doom towards a more interconnected 3D environment. You can be attacked from above, from below, in front, side to side, and the player's new method of movement is perfectly suited to the new environment. In Quake, the player moves at a frantic breakneck pace, and for the first time, the player can now jump. So this opens up huge potential for player movement within these finely crafted worlds. Games like Dark Souls and their fantastic interconnected vertical level design owe a lot to Quake. Quake's arsenal of weapons borrows heavily from what was available in Doom, with some important distinctions. Your single melee option comes in the form of a bloody hatchet. Now you can see that this at one point may have been Quake's famed legendary hammer. It's a bit sad that it ended up being a useless melee weapon that you'll never use for anything ever. Following on from the lackluster axe, you'll find some of Doom's staples, the shotgun and the super shotgun. These are superficially reminiscent of Doom's offerings, but the way you'll end up employing them differs greatly in practice. The standard shotgun fills the role of a pistol in Quake. It's a rapid-firing hit-scan weapon with a very tight bullet spread and near unlimited ammunition. You can use it to reliably deal small amounts of damage to any enemy regardless of distance. The super shotgun variant uses more ammunition and puts out a lot of damage per shot, but its spread necessitates its use only in close-range encounters. The nailgun and super nailgun provide rapid-fire capability to the player, but they differ from the offerings in Doom. The projectiles are not hit-scan and are relatively slow-moving, and they can be dodged pretty easily by Quake zigzagging enemies, requiring the player to lead targets rather than relying on instant damage. Quake's grenade launcher is the most satisfying grenade launcher I have ever found in a game ever. This thing has the perfect arc, the perfect lazy speed through the air, and the absolute perfect bounce sound. It's not only effective at bouncing around corners, but due to the fact that if you score a direct hit it explodes on impact, this weapon becomes an absolute beast. It's worth noting that enemy ogres also make great use of this weapon, and they're very intelligently placed around the maps in locations where their grenades will go bouncing absolutely everywhere if they miss you, and ruin your day. Next up is the rocket launcher. This is the grenade launcher, but without the capability for indirect damage. It also has a wonderful hidden property of allowing you to easily rocket jump. Rocket jumping was not a thing before Quake. Firing a missile at your feet seems like the stupidest thing to do ever, but Quake takes this moronic move and combines it with a pretty decent physics engine in 1996, and creates one of the coolest methods of locomotion ever seen in a video game. Last up and rounding up the weapons in Quake is the lightning gun. Now this is obviously something of a holdover from its magical medieval RPG roots.
Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt! Sleep! Lightning bolt!
My favourite thing about the lightning gun is firing it underwater results in you frying yourself. That's bloody genius. Speaking of water, Quake extends the movement capabilities of the player even further over Doom and similar titles with the addition of non-solids. Water, slime and lava are present throughout the game and they often take center stage during various levels. The player has full 3 dimensions of movement when in the water, and the game intelligently uses water in creative ways, including holding many secrets in the murky depths, all the way to using water to cancel out fall damage in a way that is intuitive and logical. Whilst navigating the dilapidated sci-fi bases, gothic castles and otherworldly plains of Quake, you will find yourself pitted against a roster of formidable enemies. The soldiers, or grunts, are basic cannon fodder. They fire hit-scan shotgun blasts in your direction and they don't take much punishment. The enforcers are tougher grunts. They come in full body armor and they fire slow-moving lasers that do considerably larger amounts of damage than the shotgun, but these lasers can be dodged by a player that is paying attention. The grunts and enforcers are often accompanied by their attack dogs, and this is an introduction to Quake's basic combat loop. Cannon fodder enemies seek to overwhelm the player with sheer numbers and distract them from higher priority targets. Stronger and more capable enemies will hang back and fire more damaging yet dodgeable projectiles, whilst melee enemies will close the gap and attempt to attack the character at a range where he's most vulnerable. This triple-pronged system of attack forces the player to target enemies intelligently, utilise their environment to minimise the number of enemies they fight at one time, and master their extremely agile movement to ensure they don't get backed into a corner. Later enemies such as the ogres begin to introduce more variables into the equation. Their bouncing grenades require the player to not only dodge the projectile itself, but keep track of where it lands. You don't want to wind up standing in the middle of an exploding grenade. The lazily flying scrags love to hang about in the corners of wide open spaces, taking pot shots at the player as they're forced to deal with other enemies first. The fact that they hover a few feet above the floor also means they're much tougher to catch with a grenade or a rocket, and often require the player to switch to a different weapon to counter their threat. The aggressive fiends quickly close the gap with players, leaping straight towards their current position. Their generous amount of health forces the player to learn to strafe. Backpedaling will result in backing into a corner, and at that point the fiends will lay into you, quickly shredding away your remaining health. Zombies shamble around slowly, flinging pieces of their own flesh at the player. They're not much of a threat on their own, but they're often seen in packs, and will very often awaken in groups to ambush the player. Killing one with conventional weapons only grants a temporary break in combat. To finish one off for good, you must employ explosives to blow them into chunky giblets. Shamblers are one of Quake's most instantly recognisable and distinctive enemies. Often serving as something of a mini-boss, the Shambler boasts an impressive amount of health and a natural resistance to explosive weapons. At range, the Shambler attacks with an instantly hitting bolt of lightning that tracks the player and can inflict considerable damage. Up close, things don't get much better, with the Shambler being a very capable melee opponent, slashing at the player with monstrous claws. Knights and their big brother, the Death Knights, often seek to overwhelm the players through sheer numbers. They quickly advance, swinging at the player with their swords. They're not much of a threat alone, but a group in a tight corridor can quickly work through an unprepared player. Tar babies are bouncing abominations seen in the final levels. These creatures bounce erratically and are extremely difficult to hit. On death, they explode, and they can cause massive damage to the player. A group of tar babies in close quarters is amongst the most difficult challenges in Quake. And finally, the Shellwrath. These spider-esque creatures prefer to attack the player from a great distance, summoning homing attacks that will relentlessly pursue the player and explode on contact. For a player to have any hope in surviving an encounter with a Shellwrath, they must utilise their movement skills and situational awareness, putting an obstacle between them and the projectile. Integral to Quake's oppressive atmosphere is its fantastic music and sound design. Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails was a huge Doom fan, and the guys at id were big 9 Inch Nails fans, with Nin being a common soundtrack at the id office during the development of Doom.
The first time I'd seen Doom and played Doom, it came at a very inopportune time where we were, I just finished the Downward Spiral album, and our keyboard player at the time walked in with the shareware of Doom. That halted any sort of work we were getting done. They put a game out that really catered to my taste. It seemed politically incorrect, and it seemed violent, and it seemed like a game that couldn't have been made by a giant company. It was fun, it was addicting. It really just struck a chord with me. The we don't give a shit attitude, that's one of the things that made it great.
He was also responsible for the sound effects in-game. The pained yells of the main character when getting hurt are Trent Reznor himself. The ammunition pickups for nail guns included the 9 Inch Nails logo on their design, as a nod to Reznor's work on the title. Any video I could do on Quake would be extremely lackluster if I didn't mention the amazing multiplayer and modding support that Quake had out of the box. Doom's deathmatch and modding community was proving to be very popular amongst its players, and id chose very wisely to focus on building upon the framework they created with Doom. Quake had out-of-the-box support for TCP/IP networking, which was a huge deal at the time. This was quickly augmented with Quake World, which added additional server functionality and tweaked some of the netcode to better support the absolutely terrible dial-up internet speeds that we all had at the time. Out of the box, Quake supported Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch, but this was very quickly expanded upon by the modding community, including such modes as Capture the Flag. Yeah, you know Capture the Flag? That staple game mode that every multiplayer game has ever had, ever? Well, it started with Quake, a Quake mod to be exact. It plays out how you'd expect, capture the flag, get points for your team. It also had a very interesting addition of a grappling hook that allowed for rapid, crazy movement. This ended up inspiring the translocator in the Unreal Tournament games. Team Fortress. Yes, Team Fortress. Holy shit, I lost so many hours to this mod as a kid. It's instantly recognizable as Team Fortress. There's a bunch of classes you got from the fast-moving scout, the rocket-launching soldier, spy, medic, pyro, engineer, and so on. This was the absolute best time that you could have online in the late 90s. The fact that it's still going under the guise of Team Fortress 2 shows what an absolutely fantastic mod this was. Then there's all the batshit crazy mods. There was a flight simulator, a rally simulator, third-person action RPGs, stealth games, chess, even chess. If you can think it up, chances are someone made it for Quake, and chances are it supported multiplayer and had servers running for it at some point. So here's the important question. How does Quake hold up today? It's fucking amazing. The level design is still right up there for what first-person shooters should strive towards. There are custom engines like Dark Places that give the game a modern graphical overhaul, and people still play the multiplayer. Although, word of warning, if you do go jumping into a multiplayer server, expect to get stomped so hard. Quake's legacy is eternal, and the game itself is just as fun and the controls still as perfectly tight now as they were back in 1996. The amazing thing with Quake is that its legacy doesn't stop with the game itself. The Quake engine is the gift that keeps on giving. You ever played Half-Life? Well, that's built on the Gold Source engine, and the Gold Source engine is a modified Quake engine. Quake 2's engine is basically just Quake 1's engine with a few bells and whistles thrown on it, and it was a hugely popular engine at the time. You ever play any of these games? It's all thanks to Quake. So many staples of the first-person shooter genre owe themselves to Quake. You heard of bunny hopping, strafe jumping. These techniques came about due to Quake's weird and quirky physics engine. Games that still support these techniques today are emulating Quake's physics and movement. Rocket jumping, telefragging, gaming clans, camping, speedrunning. You have Quake to thank for all of this. If you've never given Quake a go, you really owe it to yourself to try it out. Quake really does live forever. Well, there we go. I hope you enjoyed that trip back to 1996 with me to have a look at id Software's Quake, one of my personal favourites. Now, this is a new series on the channel, and things are likely to change and adapt as time goes on. If you want to see something different, or you liked how it worked, then leave me a comment below. I do read every comment. If you have any suggestions for future games you'd like me to have a look at, leave a comment as well, and I might get around to doing them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.